All right, welcome to the redo of the maiden voyage of deep thoughts. So I did this once before, just totally ad-libbed. This will be, off the top of my head as well, but it just went way too slow, and I didn't really make a point as to why I was doing it because I was just thinking out loud. But a few people really liked it, so I thought to do them justice, I wanted to go ahead and redo it with a very clear objective and clear message as to why on earth I would talk about fundamentals of the universe. For me, I think that the core reason for mankind to track down the fundamentals of the universe in the immediate present is due to the energy systems that we have been sold, the methodology of using energy, and what is energy in the first place. Because I think the big problem is that we've been sold a bill of goods, and I think that through people like Eric Dollard, who's essentially been a Renaissance man of rediscovering what the scientists discovered in the 1800s about electricity, Faraday and the gang, all the way up to Tesla and Steinmetz, you have a completely different perception of electricity than the electricity that we perceive today. And now we have leading cosmologists around the countries of the world essentially redefining the universe using these older theories. And if you're new to this whole discussion, you might be going, what on earth are you talking about, dude? Well, there's usually three schools of thought that govern the way we approach the thought process of trying to determine what the universe is. When you build a CERN particle collider, you have three paradigms in your head that are the three schools of thought that harness and limit the way that you think. And let's face it, today, we're not encouraged to think very much. I'm on this pilgrimage to make sure that even if I say everything in this video and you disagree with every bit of it, at least when you disagree, you're typically gravitating back to or to a new point of thought. My hope is that you don't just gravitate back to one of these three schools of thought. I think that what we have seen is an emergence of a fourth. And I'm going to go through that in this particular deep thoughts because I think it's very important that you understand that, as we always say on MK Ultra Radio, good information predicts the future. Truth predicts the future. And everything else doesn't. Everything else makes you have a feeling inside. And we talk about the fundamentals of the universe. We're really talking about what's it made out of, how's it tick. And if we don't ask those questions, we won't understand, which means we're limited to whatever we're told is true. And in this day and age, we use power systems that were given to us by groups of people. We didn't choose those power sources. We didn't subscribe to their philosophies. We just were born and we started using their techniques. Now, we're at a transition now in history where they want to move us over to other power systems and other technologies. And we're not choosing that as well, but we're being convinced that we're choosing it. We're being guilt-tripped to pay for the new form of technologies that are going to give them all the units of currency. But we shouldn't move so fast. We shouldn't jump so quickly at buying the next consumerized version of electricity or power in general and be told that these are your only options. We're having society herded by these forms of technology, and we're being told that the amount of resources that we have are depleted or depleting, and that we need to make a bunch of sacrifices due to those paradigm shifts. And I think that we have more options. So let's get at the fundamentals really quickly here. When you study physics, you go through three tiers of common knowledge that scientists work overnight to dovetail together. And one of them is Newtonian physics, where the entire universe is explained in flying particles. I'm giving you an extremely crude paraphrase. If you follow it chronologically through time, you get into the Einstein general relativity and special relativity, where we start to incorporate space-time. We start to understand that there not only is a particle or a wave of energy at a particular point in the universe, but it's at a particular time, and that he expanded our consciousness so that we could think about the fact that when something were to happen across the universe, it would be happening at a different time as well as its space. Very important. Even though I personally believe time is an illusion. But be that as it may. The next step up was your more Oppenheimer, Feynman quantum mechanics, where we got into uncertainty principles, where we could know where something was or how fast something was moving, but you couldn't know both. And there's all kinds of granular theories that go with each one of these theories. You know, with quantum mechanics, you'll get down to the point where you start studying packets of energy that can only exist either on or off, that binary system that I think we all suspect is the way that the universe works. But then there was a group of scientists in the 1800s where you have Faraday. I'd say Faraday, Tesla, and Steinmetz are probably three guys you want to look into, and I would actually look into them through the lectures that have been given by a guy named Eric Dollard. And we did an episode on Eric Dollard here on MK Ultra. Just search on Eric, E-R-I-C, in our YouTube channel, and you'll find the audio version of our show. But I would definitely search on his lectures. He's a very eccentric guy, so there's a couple guys that were out to kind of lambast him because I think he was really turning us on to some incredible historical evidence. And what Eric does, which is great because it precludes anyone from calling him a name, is that, or like crazy or something like that, is that most of his materials are simply regurgitating the materials that were published in the 1800s about electricity and crossing over into the 20th century. But essentially, these guys that are essentially the grandfathers of electricity had completely unraveled the biggest mysteries that we face today. They've been repackaged into mystery through physicists. And right now, we are almost entirely deluded in science, and I think it's a really bad situation because our children go to school, they learn a bunch of horrible theories about everything, and like a lot of religion that we absorb throughout our life, not necessarily God religion, but religion and everything that we do, we stop thinking because someone's already solved that problem is what we think. And that's the kiss of death and the blessing to those who, it's a kiss of death to society, and it's a blessing to those who sell us our electricity. And as Eric said, what the initial discoverers of electricity in our era, right, the 1700s, 1800s era, had figured out was that energy goes in a cyclical pattern, and it's infinite. So there is no limit of power in the universe. The sun is a incredible piece of proof that we have something that can just explode forever and ever and ever. Now we think the sun is completely different. Now, one of Eric's things, just to kind of, I'm going to open up the discussion into a bunch of areas, and then we'll go back and go through them in detail. One of the things that Eric had was that he was, I believe he was the son of an engineer in the Navy, and he was also just a super nerd kid. He really understood super technical things, and so what that resulted in was that at one point in his life, he was actually approached, I believe in his early teens, late teens, and he was given a lot of resources as a kid by the company RCA, which a lot of folks who are younger don't remember. But RCA, I guess, had a lot of patents on radar, a lot of patents on government technologies that dealt with signal processing, and the Navy. So RCA and the Navy came together and gave this kid reign over a particular laboratory, and in doing so revealed to him a lot of the science that they had figured out that they weren't necessarily sharing with the rest of the world. And one of the things that they revealed to him was that they knew that the sun was not a furnace of hydrogen helium. It was actually a ball of plasma energy. Now, for those of you who are trying to put your mind around this, imagine a large spherical ball of electricity, and inside it might be black. But on its outer crust, due to its huge gravitational force, it's attracting the most fundamental particles in the universe, one of obviously being hydrogen, which is the most fundamental proton-electron thing in the universe, and then helium, various levels of helium. So a lot of people who study gravity will go, well, what do you mean? You know, the sun is extremely powerful. It holds us all in place. And if you say it's hollow and made of plasma, then there's no way it could have the gravity that it has. But that's actually completely contrary to the truth. The other thing, and I'll explain that in 1 second here, but I got to say one other thing first. One of the ambient substances in the universe that our founders of electricity had discovered was ether. Now, for those of you who went to physics school and physics class in high school and college, you will know that they have deprecated out of existence ether. Almost entirely arbitrary, because they didn't want to deal with what it was. And there's plenty of scientists, including Faraday, that essentially said, look, I'm just going to accept the fact it's there. I can sense it's there, but I'm going to move on with my life because I don't need to figure out exactly what it is. I can actually benefit from its existence in my research. But what gravity is, and I'm just going to say this as a matter of fact because I think it is a physical model that needs no interpretation. It doesn't leave anything to question. We have a wind in our universe called ether. Tesla tracked the particle at 50 times the speed of light, and one other scientist tracked it as well at the 50 times the speed of light, who did not have communication with Tesla. Eric Dollar was able to do experiments in this laboratory with RCA and the Navy to sense the existence of ether using a big long wire. And what it is essentially gravity is nothing more than a negative pressure system between ether winds. And the way I like to say it is that if two of us were coming close to each other in a park, walking towards each other in a very, very windy day, if we're 100 feet away from each other, we're going to get blasted from the front, the back, the sides, all angles except for maybe our feet, equally by the winds in that windy scenario. However, if you and I continue walking closer and then pausing every maybe 10 feet to see how the wind shear changes, at some point when we're about 10 feet away, we reduce our increments to maybe feet, we will notice that between us, there's less wind because you're blocking the stuff from your back. Your back's actually blocking everything coming in, and my back's blocking the stuff coming towards you. So there's this negative pressure that ends up building between the two of us. It would be very, very weak, just like gravity, and we would start to attract to each other in the overall pressure system. Now, obviously, we would be in a relative system of a park on Earth. Our feet are being yanked down enough by the ethereal winds that are pushing on our heads that we don't actually pull together. But if we were in a vacuum, we still had this wind around us, we would immediately start attracting together like this. So gravity is nothing more than the deprivation of ethereal winds in the solar system, in the universe. But you say, well, hey, we you need mass to block this wind, right? You're saying this wind's everywhere, and I say yes. But what we don't actually have to say is that it's mass, slow-moving energy. That's what mass is, right? I'm made of mass here, and everything that's moving extremely fast is out of my visual perception, right? So infrared, X-rays, all those are totally non-perceivable to me. I might be able to feel them on my skin as I feel photons, but I can't see the photons until they hit my hand, right? I don't see them make the distance in between, travel the distance in between. But the ethereal winds actually solved a bunch of problems. One, it solved what gravity was in general, and for some reason, at the time of Einstein, at the time of all of his colleagues and his successors, they threw that out the window. And you might ask, why on earth would they rediscover that? Well, we have rediscovered that, but we've rediscovered it at the behest of the internet and us talking to each other, and not because Ivy League schools teach it. And there's a big problem with that. Right now, schools have become the antithesis of what they're supposed to do. And this is no shocker to anybody who's around an educational institution. But you have professors that essentially went to school for a very, very short period of time. When you look at someone who's going to live 80 years, if you went to school for 10 plus years, just 10 years in general to get your PhD and write your thesis, you will have gone to school 1/8 of your life. Now, that typically occurs between, say, 18 and 28, depending on what kind of degree you're getting. But let's say you hatch out of this program at 28 and you got your PhD in a particular form of science in your mind, which is a result of typically memorizing things that you were told and repeating them to the public. Very few folks go in and live in a laboratory and confirm anything that they're taught. They just don't do it. There's just, the schedule's too intense in college to do both at the same time, to confirm anything. But there are a lot of scientists who did nothing but that. And they lived in the 1800s, like Tesla, who came to America with a complete understanding of alternating currents, and everyone else. Faraday, Henry, Volta, all these guys. They lived in their own little laboratories, and I think Faraday was said to have wood, wires, and magnets. That's his whole laboratory. What you could buy out of a department store is all that one of the most intense geniuses of electricity ever had in his life, to sit there from scratch with absolutely no really measurable beginning from out of a book. There was a lot of research in the 1700s as well with magnets and sheathings and that kind of thing, a lot of theories about how things worked. So he didn't come in at complete zero, but in terms of what he was able to create in the scientific community of electricity, dwarfed whatever he started out with. And we don't do this anymore. We go to school and read it out of books that are written by the electrical companies that make the unit of purchase electricity that we're used to. Now, why say that? Well, Eric Dollard's almost cavalier subtext to a lot of his presentations is that the power companies have taught us that we have to work extremely hard to make electricity exist in the first place. Coal plant, nuclear power plant, maybe a turbine and a waterfall. And then that creates a unit of energy that you and I purchase, and then we have to buy more. And this is really hard. It's really hard to do this. We got to burn fossil fuels, supposedly, right? Oil, which is a natural byproduct of the earth and the sun mixing together their forces. But you have to buy a unit of power. And these supposedly genius bankers are the ones that actually figured out how to do it. We got to stop thinking like this from the very, very beginning. So this whole deep thought, maiden voyage redo, is all about divorcing your mind from going into a library of books, whether it be virtual internet books or college professor books, and saying that this is true, 100% empirical truth, and that this is the limitations, the boundaries and constraints around your thought process. We have to reignite the fact that we are scientists as well. I find it interesting. A lot of people will say, man is created equal. We're all created equal. I have friends that argue against that, but let's just say that that's true. All right. Well, if that's true, why aren't you doing the stuff that the people you admire do? Why aren't we, Stan Myers, who created this water fracturing engine that would totally replace oil, who was assassinated in 1998 because he was going to go public with his retro kit for your car, which is about a $1,500 conversion to a normal car to make you run tap water into your engine and fracture it into hydrogen right at the spark plug. This guy was a farmer, had absolutely no academic degrees in electrical engineering. He was a farmer. And he just sat at home and said, this is ridiculous. I got a hunch. And he knew that there was a lot of hydrogen in water in general. And he had read about all the fuel cell technology. But he did have, he had always been this way since he was young. And so he always researched stuff. And he figured out that his whole life he had heard enough information that we shouldn't believe what we're told about this stuff. And he was murdered for it. But he was trying to hold his invention for profit. He was trying to hold his technology for a product. And on one level, you don't blame him on the other side because he's up against such tyrants that he can't do that. None of us can do that. If we find a way to replace oil, you need to publish those blueprints immediately. And I wish I had those blueprints for you personally, but I don't. But what I want to get at in this particular video is just an exercise in opening your mind. I'm going to say in my own way a lot of theories that are already in books. But I want to say it in a way that we can all kind of get on board and take it where we think it could go. As I always say, I describe something, and even if I make a 3-hour video and you guys watch it and you're like, man, everything you said was wrong, dude. If you gravitate to your thought that makes me wrong in your mind, then perhaps you will come up with the replacement thought that is the truth. Because before I say anything about how the universe might be made, we have to, I think, agree that when we figure it out, the unified theory of the universe, let's just say, we'll be able to describe it to a child on a whiteboard in 2 seconds. And I think that's the truth. So let's get started. So I started hearing a lot about, Eric, or a lot of information from Eric Dollard's videos. And again, he was just going through these tomes of books from these researchers and talking about how a lot of them argued with each other. which I think was very interesting. One guy was trying to open up the mind of society, and the other guy was trying to close it down. You'll find that people who try to close up thought process, they have a hard time thinking in general. They don't like the pain that they incur when they think. And I feel like we have to embrace that in quantity, right? We can't sit. I mean, I don't know if anyone can run a marathon forever, right? You have a finish line, you stop, you rehabilitate, you puke your guts out, then you recharge up, come back 6 months later and run another marathon. So there will be cycles in your thought process. But as long as the mantra of your existence is we are going to continue pushing this thought process until we have a predictable model that will replace everything that we were told that has a limitation. And why do this? Well, we want the planet itself to have an inexhaustible amount of energy, which is going to terrify the bankers because they think free energy makes the population explode. At the same time, it blows away their economic systems to control us. At the same time, it forbids us from leaving this planet. There's a lot about the electrical properties of the Van Allen belts and the envelopes around Earth that we're just discovering, even though supposedly we flew through these deadly belts back when we supposedly went to the moon. At the very beginning of this thought, we have to figure out and define some ways of thinking about what we do know is true. Now, at a most minuscule level, we're in a gigantic information bubble. Every single thing that you see in this video, everything you can see in the room that you're in listening to this video, is a ton of information. From our DNA to our proteins, you understand. So we have to create a construct in our minds that would account for the most fundamental information systems that constitute who we are physically. Now, I start out the argument in my own mind, and I have to make this choice between dealing with it in an energy sense and dealing with it in a particle sense. And a lot of scientists, because of the duality between Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics, they have a problem feeling correct, being absolute in any one shape or form. Now, there's holographic universe theories as well, which I'm going to try to touch on this particular redo, which I didn't in the first. But for me, I simplify this argument by saying, look, I'm gonna think of it as a particle. I'm not because I think it's actually a particle, but because we have to have a unit of existence that would account for everything that we see. When we talk about information, one of the beautiful things we've discovered inside of computers is that the most fundamental piece of information in a computer is a binary number. A 0 and a 1. An off and an on. At the most fundamental level of our universe, I think it is safe to assert that there will be a fundamental particle, not two, but one, that can create the illusion of either a 1 or a 0. I don't mean that quite in a literal data stream sense, but in the fact that we have built, well, I should say the universe has built all of this stuff that we are, right? I call all of what we are a higher construct. So in all my documentation, when I write stuff down, I say, humans, that's a higher construct. Even a quark is a higher construct of this fundamental particle. Perhaps even ethereal dust might be a higher construct, but it also might be something else I'm going to talk about, which is the verb of reaction, which I'll explain in just a second. So at one level, we could just say there is one particle, and it actually has a 1 and a 0 property to it. And we don't actually have to come up with any physical properties that define how that works, right? But what I started to think was there's two elements of the universe that we can sense that we have to sort of engage before I think we should move on. And that is 3 different styles of the universe that could exist. And I don't believe that, I think they're mutually exclusive ideas, so only one out of 3 could be true. And it's the combination of infinity and finite. Let's just give you an example. Let's say that we have a universe that has infinite space and infinite stuff. Or we have a universe that's finite space, finite stuff. Or a combination of the two. Now, it's hard to say that we would have infinite energy and finite space, because that would not be kind of put more stuff in the shoebox that can fit. So I think the only middle ground that we would have between those two would be infinite space, finite stuff. Now, why get into that? We don't necessarily have to go down to that engaged level, except there's a couple interesting things that happen. One, for me, the infinite universe, infinite space paradigm actually doesn't work for me because it sort of laments and it suggests that we have an infinite creation algorithm going. And then in the finite, you actually could really account for pretty much everything that's going on. So that's a really good alternative. But in the center, you have this idea of perhaps an infinite space and a finite amount of energy in the middle. But if you do have that center scenario, then you have to link all the energy together somehow. Whether it be a particle or a packet of energy, they have to be linked, because if they didn't, they would diffuse out into the universe, because they'd bounce, and eventually someone would bounce to the point no one's going to be in front of them. It's like when you're on the highway at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's no one in front of you, it just feels sweet, right? Well, if you keep driving out there and the highway goes forever and there's never anyone else out there in front of you, you'll never come back, right? So that got me thinking, if you had a finite space, which is a little tough to think about, then you'd have to have some fabric that holds existence inside this membrane. So I tend to like the idea of the infinite universe with a finite amount of matter/energy in the center. And when I say energy, I don't mean electrons. Let me just get that out of the way. That is a human perception. That's a human product that we use at our higher level existence. I think that a fundamental level, energy would be nothing more than a state change of this fundamental particle. And I'll get to that in a little bit here. But before I move into some of the details that are simply my choice to help construct a thought in my mind about moving forward with other theories, I believe in the is. The is that there is certain constructs in the universe that simply exist. And I think this fundamental particle and all of its buddies simply exists. I don't personally need a birth story for that stuff to be discussed and believed in and used in my theories. The opposite of that is that man lives inside of a body that is born, lives, and dies. And so for us, most organic things that we see always are born, live, and die. Now, you might have that bush in front of your aunt's house that you don't know what prehistoric day it started, but it's always been there, and it'll always be there as long as you don't pour a can of oil in it, right? But we're confined into a paradigm of thought that everything has to have a start and an end. And I mention that right now simply because we have this theory of the Big Bang, which is probably one of the most ludicrous theories out there. I mean, I guess it's just shy of being truly ludicrous. But this stops our brains from thinking about anything prior to the beginning of the universe. And all mathematics completely cease to exist and cease to answer any questions at that level. And that's one reason why we have to absolutely throw it out of the window. But let me kill it for you once and for all on a scientific level. Some of you will be extremely familiar with the Big Bang. Others, you'll just have that thought, as a television show. But what they said was essentially everything that does exist has been, at one point, through gravity, sucked into what's called a singularity, which is essentially sort of a ridiculous idea that you have this infinitely tiny dot that has no mass, right? But it has everything in it. Just right there, your brain should go ridiculous, right? But they call that a singularity. And the singularity, even if you were to be able to conceive of it having no mass, would essentially be a sphere with everything in it. And a singularity is, by its own definition, by its creators, is the most perfect thing to ever be allowed to exist in the universe. It is everything. It can't be anything less than everything, right? For a singularity to exist, by their definition, it would be the most uniform object ever made. What I mean by that is that the particles that are at the bottom would exactly replicate the particles at the top, the left and the right. Any way you slice this thing, as long as you sliced it evenly down the center of the sphere, you'd have two halves that would be indistinguishable from each other. As I like to say, you can have a singularity can have a wart. It can have a flaw on it. So if something like that were to ever be condensed down and explode, you would have a universe that would be literally a giant pattern of energy. I mean, you look off to the left side, if there were stars at all, which I don't think would exist, but if there were, the exact same number on the left as the exact same number, you'd have no orientation. Everywhere you looked, you could go to South America and the sky looked exactly the same as if you're in Kansas or in England or Scotland or Russia or China or wherever. And that's not what we see. We see utter randomness in the universe. And it's not a byproduct of light limiting and what have you. You wouldn't have constellations. But because we see randomness, we know that the Big Bang, at least as defined, could have never happened, ever. And again, one of the earliest stories of mankind making a fictitious interpretation of God was a God that when it woke up, it exploded. And from its pieces and parts came everything. So all they've done is they've taken that old folktale, that old myth, and they've turned it into science. And because we all want that answer, we swallow it. But the upshot, the super negative effect that has on kids is that they don't think about it anymore. In fact, if they were to go to school and spend 8 to 10 years in school going through a master's or PhD level physics degree, trying to split that through cosmology, trying to split the atom of figuring out how the Big Bang worked, their whole life, they would have thrown away their entire life. We can't allow that to happen. So that's why I subscribe to the is. It's okay for something to be simply there. Because we see this infinite cycle of energy as it is, right? We see it all the time. I like to give people an analogy that our eyeballs do not gather photons, right? If photons are even the most minuscule microscopic thing, then they would accumulate in our eye sockets because we're constantly catching these waves of energy, right? If you want to take from the absolute wave of energy theory, well then, it's hitting the chemicals in our cones and basically pushing them down and creating different, electrical signals, which then is remapped on our visual cortex, which gives us sight. Okay. Well, if energy didn't completely dissipate from the sun, then we would just simply vaporize going into its influence, right? Because all that kinetic energy would transfer into our biology and eventually cook us. The more you're in the sun, your brain would just cook. And yeah, you can get heat stroke because you heat up the liquid in your head through friction. But this would be at a very minuscule level, and almost a neurological level, that we wouldn't have the mechanism to essentially have little steam pipes out of our head to let the energy out. Now, you could argue that from a lot of different perspectives, but I would encourage you to think of the fact that if you have an is amount of stuff, then you have an ecosystem that channels energy around the universe. Since I recorded the first one, we've had this big article go around that the scientists at a university figure out that there's plasma tubes coming out of the Earth and coming out of all planets. Again, something that would have to have been understood before we got to the moon, because something like that would kill us in a heartbeat, right? I think it's true. I think we do have a plasma inside that goes around the Earth and goes around the sun, and they're connected. But going back for a split second to this fundamental particle. Again, I'm going to say particle, but please don't take that literally and write me a letter. We need one particle to behave in two different ways. And because I think personally we might actually have an infinite is space and a finite is amount of stuff, I feel the need to link them together. So I have two different theories about this fundamental particle, and this is just a dude thinking, right? Again, I encourage you to get on a whiteboard, get in your favorite notebook, and blow me away. But if you have a particle, and you say, let's just say through some initial spin of energy, some sort of bumping in its own nebulous way, it gets a spin going. Once something spins, you have a north pole and a south pole relative to the spin. It's arbitrary, but there's definitely a center to a spin. We know that like energies will repel and opposite energies attract, right? Well, imagine taking two spinning basketballs going exactly the same route, same method clockwise, and you push them together. You automatically get a repulsion because they're bouncing off of each other, right? Now take one of them and invert it upside down. And now you actually have two of them working together like this. But one has its north pole and south pole flipped. But they're working together. And now you have an opposites attract. So merely flipping one upside down brings them together and they start to work together. Imagine you put a bunch of them together where every other one's flipped in this beautiful grid. Well, then you would have a fabric that you could work with. If, through banging together, there's some attrition where one of them flips back around and now they're starting to bounce apart from each other, you start to get different signatures within the reaction of these things bumping into each other. Perhaps the 1 and the 0 becomes a higher order construct, right? You put a whole bunch of these things together, 100,000 of them together, and one guy tries to pop out as the black sheep going the wrong way. All of a sudden you have a fabric that looks good, except there's this big bump in the algorithm because a bunch of them are resisting the 1, right? So you have this smooth fabric, and all of a sudden you get this like big bump in it, right? That's the power of a 1 and a 0 acting together to create a fabric in the universe. Now, I talked about the verb of energy, right? We are encouraged to think that everything has a physical trait. And I'm using, again, this analogy of a particle to make this conversation easier. But let's take it to a wave of energy, a wave of reaction. Now, most of you have seen kinetic transfer happen in your lifetime. And most of the time with lining up a bunch of dominoes and hitting them, and all that kinetic energy just goes, all the way down. And we know that if we lined up 1,000,000, and they've done it, 1,000,000 dominoes, and you tick over that first one, that kinetic energy packet will go all the way around completely down to the last one in a gymnasium or a warehouse or a mall, right? That shows you the power of a wave of kinetic energy doing a transformation mechanism. This is through, obviously, an impact transformation, right? Now imagine our spinning particles doing the exact same thing. That when one of them gets a little bit out of tune, because maybe it's in a 3-dimensional matrix, right? Maybe it's in a 3-dimensional set of these things spinning. Any disturbance in their alignment is going to create a huge reaction, because it's just like when, I don't know if you ever watch Formula Racing, when two Formula cars get really close together, these tires are all going in the same direction, thus creating, when they impact each other, a major repulsion, because one of them's going to bounce in the air. Same exact thing. But if it was all packed inside of a grid, a matrix of of all this energy, then you're going to get this exploding force of really an infinite amount of force. And you could argue some resistance within this system, but I think that you would find that just like the domino, the resistance would be behind the initial wave. Okay? Now, at the more fundamental level, you probably would have a difficult time stopping this reaction, but at a higher level, you have a lot more inertia being expressed on this energy as it moves through, like a photon. Now, in the end, that energy will just simply dissipate back into the fabric of the universe and be absorbed. So we create this situation like a plasma ball, which is the sun or any form of light. And we send that power out from a particular reaction. Again, the Navy and RCA were actually saying that the sun was a portal, but they didn't know where the energy was coming from, and they may actually be correct. It's probably one of these cyclical, vortexes where everything's coming together and spitting out. So it might be a non-visible light, and then it comes together and creates this vortex, which is outputting a sphere. And so our mind, we think of it as another dimension. It's coming from another dimension. But the idea is it's simply non-visible to us. And dimensions don't really exist. Dimensions are frameworks for us to have conversations, right? So if we say, within the dimension of infrared light, yada, yada, yada can happen, that's just the dimension. And, once a scientist can actually label a certain sector of the universe and a sector of the world and any other paradigm of conversation in a mathematical constraint, they'll say it's a dimension. So you'll hear all these people talk about, well, I think they're up to 30 dimensions now. All right, so it's just a bunch of mathematicians playing divide-up games. They're creating the phylum, kingdom, class, order, structure within mass in the universe, right? So there's always been this duality since I've been a kid between the Newtonian physics and more of your wave of energy physics, right? Where you actually have a wave of energy that moves and a sine cosine wave of some sort, depending on the frequency of light. And I watch these people, and my teachers actually argue over which way it was. Like, so if that was the big battle they had to have, right? The Democrats and Republicans going at it, right? And for me now, I essentially have erased the need for that argument, because for me, an electron cloud is nothing more than a reaction of dielectric and magnetism waves interacting to create this reaction that we see as an electron. And we can harness that particular energy into electricity, right? This is where we get at the fundamentals of why this entire thing, I think, we need to open up this conversation, because we need to find different forms of energy at the fundamental conceptual level. Because if you're living on planet Earth, the only forms of energy we acknowledge is electrons, electricity, right? Now, sure, you could say, a water hits a treadmill and turns it, and you could just take that force inside a windmill and use it to grind grain or whatever. There have been attempts to create other forms of power. There's combustible powers between oil and hydrogen and that sort of thing. But again, it's always in a unit of energy that then is transformed back into the intangible, a thermal discharge, some other ethereal divorce that we have from the original power, and then we can't get it back. Perpetual motors are absolutely outlawed in the patent office in America and probably around the world. But you're not allowed to bring that machine in. It's not allowed. So when Stan Myers brought his hydrogen fracturing engine in there, they denied him the patent just at face value. So he had to build a prototype, and he brought it in and he proved it to him. And then we forgot him. How crazy is that? This was the 1990s. This is less than 3 decades ago. The guy had cracked it for us. Tap water burned and became steam. I can't think of anything more eco-friendly than that. But the Egyptians, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but I want you to follow me on this. The Egyptians seemed to be building something other than a tomb when they built these giant pyramids. Because we had a physicist and electrical engineer look at the pyramids and study them and said, oh my God, this is anything but a tomb, for one thing, right? We know what the tombs in the Valley of the Kings look like. They're extremely ornate, beautiful. They look like they have burial rituals attached to them. But inside the pyramids, even if you said the thing was looted of its possessions, it doesn't bear any semblance to a tomb. It's not even big enough to give your base respects to a pharaoh that would be powerful enough to create this pyramid. Now, as a footnote before we begin, we think the pyramids go back a long way. Like pre-Ice Age, 39,000 BC, sort of old, probably before. But what we figured out was that the rocks that were used to construct the Great Pyramid especially used a very conductive limestone in the interior, meaning it would be very electrically prone to gather any type of electron charge. The outer stones on the outside provided an insulator because they were built out of a limestone that had no conductivity, meaning it would insulate whatever was charged in the center from ever escaping, which then gives it a charge inside. The pathways inside the pyramids were built out of something called red granite, which is not only conductive, but it actually provides current. And it's one of its natural atomic properties. So that would allow electricity to be channeled up and down the runways of the inside of the pyramids themselves. In addition, it was built on top of a giant plateau, and the plateau is actually, constructed-wise, taller than the pyramid above it, which is phenomenal. Inside that was a catacomb of water chambers that would actually be able to take the electricity from the pyramid and distribute it across the plateau. So anything else built on top of the plateau could simply reach down into that water and charge its electrical signature up. On top of that, it was built on top of something called an aqua ravine. An aqua ravine is a natural catacomb of rock that has water flowing through it, which is very electrical. It takes electricity from the earth and moves it up. So you have a pyramid generating electricity down, and you have the aqua ravine charging energy up, all being caught inside this conductive water that's inside the plateau. We think we have hieroglyphs that show that they had electrical objects. And of course, they did everything in symbolism, so we poo-poo it away as myth, right? As well as rich aristocratic bankers who are white can't allow you to think that any other race could possibly be smart. I personally believe the Egyptians no longer exist as a race. I think they were completely onto themselves a species that of man that is either left or has been just sort of bled into the rest of the races on Earth. But they showed an aptitude that was absolutely unbelievable for understanding electricity. And when Tesla built his gigantic tower in, I believe, 1917, that generated electricity out of the ether, because I'm going to get into how the pyramids did what they did, he built it on an aqua ravine, had the exact same sort of passageways down below. He had his own little mini plateau that he built it on top of. So it seems like he understood the basics of how the pyramids were put together. But the way that the pyramids actually generate electricity was something that is very fundamental to this conversation, which is that the pyramids is this big, gigantic 2.5 million rock thing. So like 2.3 or whatever. And it's actually spinning on the surface of the Earth at about 24,000 miles an hour. The Earth is cruising through the solar system about 10,000 miles an hour, and we're cruising through the galaxy at God knows what, maybe 150,000 miles an hour. The ethereal winds that we talk about are obviously an extremely fundamental wave, particle, whatever. Maybe it's the verb of energy I'm talking about. But they bring into all mass their existence. Things that are conductive actually capture more of the ethereal winds in a frictional way. Things that are less conductive are more permeable, and the ether goes straight through them. The Earth, which is so massive, it blocks and absorbs and repels this ethereal wind, thus creating the big negative gravity bubble around us. I have been convinced by these other individuals that the Earth has a plasma interior, just like the sun, as well as all of our neighbors circling the sun, that we have an electrical interior that actually expands over time as it gathers more electricity from the sun. The sun is a very special thing. I think that in the similarities that we have, obviously it has more of a vortex of energy being metabolized into what it is, right? The outer crust burns. The outer crust has fusion and fission on the outside. Anything that's atomically possible is probably occurring on the outside of the sun's edge. So when you look at it with a telescope, you see this furnace-y, bubbly, goopy matter, and you see, coronal mass ejections coming off and going back in. But then there's things called sunspots, where you're actually able to look into the bowels of the sun. If you watch the wormy paths that all the mass takes on the surface of the sun, the only time we ever see that on Earth is when we stimulate mass, energy, molten, whatever, with electricity. You get these wormy sort of patterns, right? Very important in distinction when we talk about what we're maybe talking about to solve our energy problems. So the conversation is to try and figure out what we're made out of, and then learn how to get along with it. We need to explore the stars. We do. Eventually, Earth's going to get pummeled by something. Earth's going to have cataclysms. We're going to have to get off this planet eventually, right? For those of us who follow expanding Earth, we do believe there's a point where Earth will actually expand so much that we will turn into a Jupiter, where we are mainly a gaseous, sort of sun-like object. A binary star may be nothing more than a planetoid that actually got big enough to ignite into a sun, and then it's circling the sun. So, there's a lot of interesting possibilities out there. But for us to travel to stars, we have to figure out how to be out there in that toxic climate, which is the solar radiation, which NASA figured out by 1988 was so toxic that a human being would die virtually instantly if being exposed to it, even without a flare. And their theory to solve it in 1988 was to surround a capsule with 6 inches of water, and that didn't account for a coronal burst hitting it. Again, more evidence of why we didn't go to the moon. Right now, NASA has a program called Project Orion, where they're trying to get a capsule through the Van Allen belts without killing flesh inside, and the first maiden mission didn't have any humans in it. Again, but supposedly, from 1968 to 72, with Apollo 10 leading the journey to the moon, we supposedly went through all this very lethal stuff. 14 times minimum? What I'm trying to get at is that if we can start building up from this binary idea up to life as we know it, then we might get sort of a fundamental understanding and make peace with our universe. Now, something I mentioned in the first version of this episode was a scientist by the name of Stephen Wolfram. And there's a gigantic book you can buy of his that talks about the science of patterns. And you look at the book, and if you just were to thumb through it, you would think some guy is just going off on this little nerd fest of Mathematica, trying to figure out, well, if I put this much stuff in there, I get this pattern, and look at this pretty pattern. It actually is way, way deeper than that. But what he essentially came up with was that he ran a computer simulation. We used to have these simulations, life simulations, where they put a couple particles in and give it a few wiggly rules, and if it bumped into other pixels, one pixel could wiggle across the screen. The kid had to have 2 pixels to get it started, and if they bumped into each other, they could actually make decisions about how to combine, and then they make offspring, and they'd curl around. Some of these guys have had programs running for 30 years, running life programs. It's very, very interesting. But what Wolfram did was essentially say, if I were to start the universe off with a fundamental set of objects, unique objects, what would they do in 3D space? But he put it down in a Cartesian coordinate system, right? An X and Y, no Z, no T. And he just said, go. Actually, he had a T in there. But he watched them grow across this pattern, or I guess this Cartesian plane, right? This 2-dimensional plane, just to see what would happen. And he discovered something that completely shocked him, which was that he thought that we would need a lot more fundamental particles, elements of the atomic elements, to create the life that we have today, which in one realm is definitely true. But at a fundamental level, he realized that when he got, say, I think the number, it's been a couple of years since I read the book, I believe it was 3 to 4 was actually the magic number. 3 to 4 random, unique elements created infinite life patterns. They never made a pattern that started looking like a tapestry or some sort of collage of some sort. But when he went 2 and below or 5 and above, he started getting these elaborate patterns, which everybody now puts on everything. It's really funny. But his point was to say, that's not my point. My point is that I'm looking for life. I'm looking for the pattern that makes life. And what he did was he took the necessity for us to create a very complex unified theory, and he said, no, it's not that at all. Look, with three separate particles, we can create life that goes on forever, like crazy organic patterns that simply go forever. And 4 works as well. So for me, that negates right away the Big Bang. Any type of unified singularity that when it explodes, it distributes everything perfectly. That just can't exist, right? We don't have to have the solution to say that what we've been presented is not the truth. That's the other big one. When it comes to the 2 particles I talked about, if you had a finite container, which might actually, in its nebulous methodology, which I don't understand at all, which is why I don't tend to subscribe to that, you might get a little bit of the jostling original energy that you're talking about that would negate a need for a Big Bang. But if you go to infinite space and sort of this nebulous group of energy that is linked together, all right, you also negate the Big Bang, but you also account for how everything could exist within it. Now I'm going to get into some existential stuff that I've heard over the years, like the holographic universe and some other ideas about perhaps the illusion of 3D and that sort of thing. But I think those are more just anecdotes of science. Wasn't it cool? We could think of it like this. A buddy of mine created a computer out of carbohydrates in college. It can happen, right? Doesn't mean that's what the universe is made out of. But the idea of linking the stuff together became very interesting to me. And so I had this duality between linking stuff together and creating a binary system. And maybe with Wolfram's little hint, a system that constitutes only 3 to 4 potential combinations. Like maybe it's locked into a 3 all the time, but maybe in a weird situation you get a 4-leaf clover, you get the 4th one. Who knows, right? But I started thinking of these spheres actually starting to coexist in the same space, right? They start to overlap. But like the MasterCard logo, which that shape escapes me. I need to look that up. But imagine that the reaction that you could have is all constrained by how tightly packed these things are. And there's a little bit of wiggle room, right? To the point where their overlap is essentially minuscule. And at some point, they're almost completely 2 of them on the same place at the same time. And maybe that's the way it is. Maybe it's a bunch of particles bouncing around. There is no limitation in the 4th dimension of being in the same place at the same time. But the point of my argument is perhaps it is the overlap of these fundamental particles that creates some sort of resistance, some sort of force, torque, turn that starts to jostle them and spin them. that they in themselves are their own force mechanism. There isn't any outside external force that has to act on them to get them spinning, which is where you get the Big Bang Theory. But they all kind of work together and move around. Now, in any system where you have even a finite amount of space, it's a little bit larger than the stuff you have inside. You're going to get a lot of diffusion bouncing around. So you could get a pretty cool environment that matches what we're dealing with ethereal winds, explaining gravity, explaining the pyramids, explaining the Tesla coil, right? The Tesla coil has been completely re-engineered in our eyes to be a bug zapper that energy goes up and zaps out the top. When Tesla's entire creation of this thing was to power his labs, he had the ball on the top that would grab ethereal winds and drag it down into a coil, and it was a minuscule amount of power going down, and then it was capacitated up through coil technology, which is basically you can double the charge of a particular unit of power, electrons, let's just say, and at the bottom you route it into whatever circuit you need to be working with, right? Mark Twain wrote about Tesla's laboratory not having a total lack of wires, yet everything was powered. Mark Twain wrote that the ceiling had light in it, but there was no lights up there. So somehow there's some ethereal electrical cloud up there. And nobody died of Madame Curie cancer going into his shows and watching stuff. He got up in front of a World's Fair and covered his body in plasma, right? But he never took the charge onto himself. So when you have individuals who seem to have this amazing ability to completely master electricity, and yet all of their theories largely disagree with everything that our children are taught when they go to school, as a parent, as even a person who's personally interested, you have to just put a tack in that and say, no way, this goes no further. I need to figure out what it is. And this is what Eric Dollard's lectures are all about, is that when the physicists came in after Steinmetz, which is essentially Einstein, which we're not allowed to say anything bad about that guy, they essentially flushed everything that was going to give humanity the thought process and the paradigm to allow infinite energy systems to be conceived of in the mind. Just think about that for a second. We're worshiping people that turned our heads off and coined the phrase, oh, you only use 3% of your brain, which nobody understands what the hell that statement means, really, most of the time. They'll look into the multiple layers in our visual cortex and say, we only use a tiny sliver of the amount of genetic matter that is actually present to be able to process vision. If I recently saw a anthropological documentary, or presentation, I should say, where the guy had actually kind of likened the visual cortex to 5 slices of cheese. When you buy cheese from the store in the little condom, right, you put 5 slices out, and we use half of a single slice. But we've got 4.5 slices of our visual cortex, which is unused. But when we open up the brains of all other animals on Earth, they use 100% of their visual cortex. So for some reason, man has got this weird hobbling genetic limiter. And of course, he pushed that up into UFO theories and stuff, which is episode 2 of Deep Thoughts. We get into a little bit of that. But what I've been trying to do is reimagine the very mechanics of the ecosystem of energy. When it gets too complex, I usually shut down the theory and start back over again, trying to distill from it simplicity. And I would encourage you to do exactly the same. Once you get to a point where you're having to crack open gigantic books of mathematics, if you want to see it, if you want to prove that it exists, you need to construct an experiment, then that's probably where you need to go. But before your hunch gets totally iced over and polished, I would encourage you to keep it simple. And I think that what we can do for the sake of argument, with the plethora of concepts and paradigms and dimensions that we can conceive of, let's go with the following. Let's go with a finite universe, finite space, finite stuff, right? It's all constrained. Gives the chance for the ethereal winds to move around inside the reaction bubble of the matrix. It allows people that want to interpret those waves of energy as a hologram to have an absolute mechanism by which they can perceive the universe. It also accounts for a few things that are a little existential. And let me throw this one at you. Now imagine you have this somehow shape that has a matrix of all these fundamental particles. And like I said, objects banging together create these waves of dispersion and distribution. So you get things that on a higher level look like electrons or photons or something like that. And let's say time is in there as well. And let's say that through quantum mechanics, let's use quantum theory for a split second, that we only resonate at a particular frequency within this matrix that we can see. You are on my frequency. At least I think you are. So you can see me. We're compatible. If I made this video in another dimension, you couldn't see it, and everybody in that dimension could see it. And all this is a infinitely condensed amount of this particular material that we're talking about. Or again, time doesn't really have to play a constraining role on the theory. Some of us have intuition and almost the ability to sense things before they happen. And not in any crazy psychic way. It's like, it's going to know you're going to get an A on that test. Nothing like that. But on certain catastrophic events or certain weird events, we can sense things occurring before they actually occur. I had a really weird situation with 9/11 the night before I went to bed. Life was good. I had no reason to be pessimistic. And I literally had a feeling that something really bad was going to happen, which was sort of out of context of my emotional bubble, right? I wasn't thinking negatively, but I had this feeling. And then all of a sudden I saw planes. Now, I don't think a lot of planes were involved with 9/11, despite popular theory. But regardless, that's how the story went down the next day. Now, imagine taking this fabric of space-time, as dictated by some of maybe the concepts we talked about, and you're approaching some sort of event that's going to greatly affect a lot of energy. But you're approaching it. And if you took a paper towel and you drop an eyedropper on it, you're going to get that dispersed, diffused, bleed pattern from your eyedropper, right? Very red in the center, pink on the outside until it blends into white. But now you're on the outer path and you're coming towards that stain in the cloth. You can start sensing pink before you get to the red. And if you're on the path to cross to the center of the actual epicenter of the actual event, it's not just a sense. If you're just sensing the event, maybe you're passing a little too high and you never go through the epicenter. So you felt it, but you're like, man, I feel better. I felt a little weird there for a little while, but it didn't happen, so I feel good. If you go through the epicenter of the whole thing, you see it before it happens. You feel it before it happens, I should say. And then, of course, you're greatly affected after it occurs, depending on how you experienced it, right? So that might explain some of the more existential things that occur to us. In terms of people who view things in a holographic universe, well, all they're doing is they're interpreting the waves of energy and how they bounce off each other in a three-dimensional way to create the perception that we actually have here. I like the holographic universe idea of how to metabolize up all these waves into visible light and visible reality. It makes sense to me. I hope this was thought-provoking, if anything else. The goal of this video is simply to provoke thought, really. We have to be comfortable thinking about things that we have no knowledge of, which is a little bit weird, right? Me sitting in a vacuum and thinking up an idea of how a particle might work together. I think that's really important for all of us, because at some point those crazy random thoughts are going to draw in from the universe, in my opinion, the truth that is the universe. If you think about it, all mathematics exists whether or not we discovered them it or not, right? The cavemen were living by mathematical principles that they didn't understand, but they were embedded in it. So a lot of poets and philosophers have always lamented about the idea that we are the truth. We exist within the truth that is the universe. It's not like, I don't know, it's not just a crystal-hugging concept. The idea is that we are the fabric of the universe. We are the fabric. So understand that you grabbing knowledge out of the universe to solve any one of these problems is sort of a natural cycle of you listening to the math that's going through your head. You're listening to the overall algorithms of the universe. You're in it. You're in it whether or not you want to be in it or not. So let your mind relax and feel it. Like Philip K. Dick said, he had a river of information, a river of truth that he got all of his writing ideas from. He would look down into it and he would see it because he acknowledged it was there. He tuned himself to see it, and he could just live in different worlds. Well, maybe he was living in another frequency for a split second, or maybe he could see it like a looking glass into another area of the universe, right? I know it's fairly existential, but I want to make sure that all the padlocks on your mind, all of this memorizing and repeating indoctrination, all the tenured professors that you know that are protecting their entire 50-year career with the minuscule amount of college they actually attained, doesn't affect you. You have to be able to open your mind. We're trying to rebuild society right now, right? We're trying to outmaneuver the maneuvers. And they've dumped into our brain one limit after another, and we've got to do it. We've got to fight it. We've got to push through. Because again, if we have thought process, we get an idea. And ideas can never be killed as long as you don't lose it. And once you taste the fruit that is bared outside of the paradigms that control your brain, it's so addictive you can't stop. You can't stop eating. And that's what happens to a truther when they go out there and start ingesting information. Now, we have to police, obviously, what we learn and make sure we don't go crazy. But it's even fun to go down a path that's utterly ridiculous, and for 2 or 3 hours, you're totally convinced that something is true, and it's eventually end up 2 hours later going, nah, that's ridiculous. But I had a lot of fun letting my mind entertain this possibility, right? So anyway, I've gone on quite a bit. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. This is, again, just a little weird series. These are very difficult to put together to keep interesting, so there probably won't be very many deep thoughts. But I had these conversations with the fans, and that's why I want to put these into videos, because we're all thinking alike, and I feel like I just want to have a buffet of content that you might be interested in. But anyway, go to mkultraradio.com to catch the normal show on Sunday nights, 5 o'clock Pacific time. You can also tune in through KXRZ The Razor here in Los Angeles on the internet. Wednesday nights, every once in a while, I'll put together something called The Essay, which is essentially more of this kind of how to improve ourselves, how to expand our mind, how to eat healthier, how to think better, that kind of stuff, because we have to rebuild society at the same time we take it back from these controllers. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. As we always say, learn the rules that rule you. Over now.